Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Taproom Tastings, and thank you for bearing with us as we took a month off in January for various things coming up, but we are back and ready to go. So to begin, we would like to acknowledge that the history of our site does not start with Europeans. The town of Ridgefield exists on the ancestral homelands of the Ramapo, Munsee Lenape, and Wishquaesgeek people. They were the original stewards of this land on which Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center stands today. We thank them for their strength and their resilience in stewarding this land, and we hope to continue their legacy of protecting this site and its history. I am Catherine Prescott, Chief Curator here at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center, coming to you from our tap room. And my co-host for Taproom Tastings is, as always, Mary Saltis Ottamanelli, Executive Director of the Hendrick I Lott House in Brooklyn, New York. So, as I said, welcome to Taproom Tastings, a virtual conversation about historic trends in food, drink, and culture. Throughout this program, we'd love to hear from you as well. So as always, we welcome comments and questions in the chat at any time during the program. So if you have something you're interested in learning more about or a question about something we're talking about, feel free to just leave something in the chat for us. And tonight we are continuing a conversation from last season on immigrant foodways, and we are taking a deeper dive into Asian American foodways, exploring how Asian immigrants and Asian Americans adapted their traditional foods to the tastes and habits of their new home. As we learned last year in immigrant foodways, we often see a lot of connection with foodways and personal identity and cultural identity and things like that. So we decided that it would be really interesting to dive into Asian American foodways, partially because I think American Chinese food is one of the most well-known and probably one of the most popular, quote unquote, Americanizations of what might be considered ethnic cuisine. I'd argue probably equal only with maybe American Italian food in terms of like broad knowledge about the quote unquote authenticity, which is another thing we could talk about tonight. So I think probably we'll start with American Chinese food because that is sort of the first Asian cuisine that became widespread in white American culture as well, and sort of paved the way for other Asian cuisines to also enter into the white American palate. And one thing I did learn, which is kind of astounding to me, but in 2022, there were over 50,000 Chinese restaurants in the United States, which is more than McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and KFC combined.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But then you think about it, and there's often every small town has at least one Chinese restaurant, oftentimes more than one. Even here in Ridgefield, we have a couple of different Chinese restaurants. So
it is really high. I found it was a 2023 Pew demographic study. I was able to find it 12% of all the restaurants in the United States served Asian food. It's a lot of restaurants. And then primarily the majority of them, nearly 4 in 10 of those restaurants served Chinese food specifically. And then what astounded me was the ratio of restaurants to like total population was that it was the restaurants that served Japanese food accounted for 28% of Asian restaurants in the United States, which was the second most common cuisine. And then like Japanese Americans who have come to the United States comprise 7% of the total US population. So like that's a lot. The first thing that I thought of, a very pop culture moment of me, is in My Cousin Vinny when Marissa Tomei's character goes to Alabama, Arkansas, one of those states. She goes, "Oh, the Chinese food here must be so bad because it's in the middle of nowhere." But it's that sentiment is that it doesn't matter where you go, there's always going to be a Chinese restaurant. There's always going to be some sort of like Asian takeaway, regardless how small the town is. And it's so interesting because the more you travel and the more you try these places, they they changed based on like taste demographics as well. I find that when I leave New York City, or even if I go to a different borough, everything is like tweaked a little bit, and everybody's got their like family recipes that they use and different kind of levels of seasonings. And I 10 out of 10 love trying everything. Can't say anything better.
So the Asian population, we have Chinese coming to America since the early 1800s. And I don't want to say there were no Chinese or Asians of any ethnicity in America before the 1800s, but the first records we have are really the early 1800s, mostly merchants. They're trying to build a trade relationship with the new United States. And so we have a lot of merchants bringing Chinese goods to American markets, and also bringing American goods back to the Chinese markets. So Americans have always, had a fascination with Asia. A lot of European cultures did as well, and especially in the 18th century when you have the introduction of tea and all of the kind of accoutrement that come along with that. And so it is pretty early on in the history of our nation that the United States really forms a trade relationship with China, specifically. And but you don't really have people settling in great numbers in the United States until the mid 1850s, or a little before the 1850s with the California Gold Rush. And then at that point, you have a lot of Chinese laborers coming into California to look for gold, to be gold miners, but also to work on the Transcontinental Railway. The Transcontinental Railway hired very specifically Chinese laborers, Chinese men, because they could pay them less than most other laborers, and it was a dangerous job. And we kind of see this devaluing of Chinese people and all the things that kind of come around in Chinese culture throughout the 19th century, really. And that does reflect a little bit even into today. There's this idea that Chinese food generally is pretty cheap. And that really starts all the way back in 1850 when we first get the first large Chinese settlements here. And I think one of the reasons why American Chinese food kind of is very different from what most people would claim is authentic Chinese, that would be recognizable to most mainland Chinese people, is because, well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that the early immigrants were almost exclusively men. In 1855, only 2% of the Chinese population in the United States was female. By 1890, it was only 5% of the Chinese population was female. And so these men are coming to the United States and they have to learn how to cook for themselves. So they're not kind of doing traditional, this is the way my mother taught me and her mother taught her and all that kind of passed down through generations. They're kind of making, developing these cooking techniques on their own. And they're also using local food, local products, ingredients that aren't really available in China. So they have to adapt those. But also a significant percentage of the early immigrants are coming from one place in China. China is huge. It has a wide variety of cuisines, but in the early 1850s, most of the people coming to the United States come from Taishan, which is in what was then called Canton, now Guangdong, in the southern part of China. And so American Chinese food really kind of calls back to the very specific Cantonese style of cooking. And that tends to be a little bit sweeter, has some more sauces than other places. And we can see that in the foods that are most commonly found in American Chinese restaurants these days.
I'm looking up. I found a direct quote. I can't find it. I took so many notes. I'm using my computer today. The elder millennial in me loves paper, and I'm struggling. There was, at least in New York City, as the railroads were completed and the Chinese immigrants start coming to New York City to settle in a little bit more permanently, you see the Lower East Side really boom up. We have Chinatown that historically is still Chinatown. And they're kind of making their way. They're making enclaves within the Lower East Side enclaves, so they're on top of each other with Irish immigrants, with Italian immigrants, with the German immigrants, with the Jewish immigrants, and they're all kind of like living together in different ways, which is always really interesting to see how people can cohabitate peacefully, a concept. But it was interesting because there was one restaurant tour critic, I'm going to try to find the quote, but he was saying that, and he compared Chinese food to French food, and he said it was a lot less technical and they just understood taste better. And I think he was probably referring to a chop suey dish, which we'll talk about later. But it was this just like, French food is just so technical and it's so precise and they know what they're doing, whereas the Chinese they're putting in their feelings into their food and it shows better. And I was like, I didn't think I would ever see a critic compare those two, but here we are. And I was like, yeah, I've had French food. It feels very technical. I could see that. But again, it goes back to where you go, where do you get your Chinese food, what tastes a little bit better. But also looking at flavorings. But
yeah, and I think as Chinese food kind of spreads and travels eastward along the rail lines, as you get out of the cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, the food does start to change and becomes more and more like what we think of as American Chinese food nowadays, because these immigrants, as they're coming into spaces where there are fewer and fewer other Chinese immigrants, they also end up getting pushed out of the communities, these small communities, and they end up kind of siloed in things like food service and laundries. Those are the two main industries that the Chinese kind of are allowed to do outside of cities where they can build their own communities. So really the first Chinese restaurants in the United States come up in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and they are catering towards other Chinese immigrants. But once you get out of the city, the restaurants are actually catering towards the other people, and you start seeing this mix of American, what we might think of as like classic American food with Chinese spins on them. And so you get things like pork chops and apple pie in these restaurants. as well. And you start to see the beginnings of this more standardized menu that then over the next 150 years just kind of ends up being what you find in nearly every Chinese restaurant in the United States for the most part.
There's also using new ingredients and bringing over new ingredients. I saw the traveling of bok choy to the United States is like a big one of, we have cabbage, but it's not quite the same. So we're going to bring bok choy, and that becomes part of a staple in New York City, at least within the agricultural district. You start seeing that being grown alongside cabbages, which the Lotts grew tons of. And you see that mixture, and like you said, of it becomes a little bit sweeter, and they start using these new flavors that are accessible to them that kind of taste the same, but it's also the industry is based off of a bunch of men who were just trying to cook, and not necessarily in the most traditional sense. And it's this like, well, I have it, we're just going to use it, we're going to make our best from it. And that's that evolution that you see compared to traditional food, traditional Asian food from different cultures. Because I see that when I was looking into New York City stuff. Thai dishes, Filipino dishes all get a little bit of an American twist to them because our taste buds are very low. We don't take well to spice. We don't take well to sour tastes or anything kind of an extreme necessity. So too much salt, too much this, too much that. So it becomes a very dulled down version of what we should be eating. But even to your point, I noticed a lot of the Chinese restaurants specifically are one of the types of restaurants that make it out of their enclaves. So in the 20th century, you have that burgeoning middle class that's going into all of these enclaves in New York City and trying all of this like exotic Chinese food or exotic German food. And they're going in and they're trying all of the Italian food in all these little tiny restaurants within the Lower East Side, right? They're all bounded by these neighborhoods. But it's usually the Chinese restaurants that are able to leave those neighborhoods specifically that they're bounded to, and they can open up. And you start to see so many start opening up on the Upper East Side, all the way up towards Manhattan, into Brooklyn, into the outer boroughs. And they're the only really ones that are able to establish themselves as restaurants that don't close down so shortly after because of the popularity of them. So it's this weird mix of, I kept reading the word exotic and new and different, but it becomes such a staple in New York City culture that I was like, well, how new and different could it be if it's part of like everyday eatery, like eating for us. Sorry. But yeah, it was this, I kept seeing foreign, I kept seeing different, but I was like, there's a Chinese food, there's 3 within like a 5-block radius of my apartment, right? Like it can't be that different. It can't be that unnecessary. Yeah, I've got more Chinese restaurants than I have pizza in my neighborhood,
Yeah, I
So it's
think
interesting to see those comparisons.
the shift in how white Americans and kind of the shift in sentiment towards Chinese food change is really interesting because there's like a bunch of different things kind of all had to happen at the same time for this shift to occur. Because in the later part of the 19th century, there was anti-Asian sentiment was extremely high. And it culminates in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where that barred almost all Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States. But the one type of immigrant that was allowed was merchants. They were considered non-laborers. And so that was an occupation that was allowed to immigrate into the United States. And by 1915, restaurant owners were also considered merchant class. You could get a merchant visa as a restaurant owner. And so Chinese immigrants actually used this to facilitate more immigration into the United States. So they would kind of, Chinese in the US would pool their money together to purchase property to turn into a restaurant. and they would use this rotating management system. Because once you have a merchant visa, you are now allowed to bring your family over from China. You're allowed to travel back and forth to China. And so you see this total boom at a time when most Americans are very much anti-Asian. At the same time, you see this huge boom in Chinese restaurants all over the country. And I think it just sort of starts overwhelming everybody. And the the historian Heather Lee from NYU Shanghai, she calls it gastro diplomacy. But it's also just like this complete overwhelming, we're just gonna like flood everyone with Chinese food. And so eventually you're gonna like try it.
I mean, it worked though. I thought I'd put up some postcards so not everybody had to look at us while we were talking. These are just from the Museum of the City of New York. These are beautiful postcards that I was able to find on their digital collections of Chinatown in the early 20th century. And they're always beautifully illustrated. I will say, I thought this was interesting. The one on the left says Chinese and Japanese novelties. So even in the early 20th century, they were kind of squished together, even though they weren't. There was, I mean, we still have a little Tokyo these days. So it was interesting to kind of see that that was the storefront. But I love a good hustle and bustle scene from New York City. That always makes me happy. Yeah, New York City gets pretty packed. The statistics on the Lower East Side are quite astounding. There is not much Chinese immigration in the 18th century. From what I can find, it's very minimal. It doesn't really start until, Catherine says, after the gold rush. They come into New York City, they move east. I was going to say west. I'm so used to saying west. They come back east in the 1860s, 1870s, post-Civil War. And they bring a lot with them. You can see them traveling through the East and stopping in places like Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And I read something in the Dakotas that they would stop and open up restaurants along the way. So not everybody even makes it to New York City. Then is a statistic that I have. So 1859, the New York Times estimated that there was about 150 Chinese men living in the district, working as sailors, cooks, and vendors. And by 1880, it had gone up to about 1,100 immigrants. And then it opens up it closes down because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But by 1930, there's over 4,000 Chinese men and women both living in Chinatown. And then by the Immigration Act of 1965, you see that number boom. So 1960, there's about 11,000 Chinese immigrants in the United States. And by 1995, in New York City, there's over 150 by 1995. 150,000 by 1995. So these are big, big booms. And then you see another shift in the 1970s, which makes way into Chinatown. And a lot of the population in Chinatown is now moving into the outer boroughs. So you have a lot of Queens is the next big Chinese hub, Asian hub in New York City. You get a little bit in Brooklyn, and you get a little bit in Manhattan enclaves, but most of the population ends up moving into Queens, which in and of itself, if you're from New York City or you know New York City, is just another version of the Lower East Side with enclaves everywhere. If you go 10 blocks up, you go 10 blocks down. You've shifted into another like little Tokyo, little Philippines, little Greece, little everything, which is great because the food is always great no matter which way you go. But it was interesting to see those shifts, especially as the immigration laws open up and shift down. And it also depends on American sentiments. I saw a lot of shifts up and down for Japanese immigrants coming to the United States as well, depending on political agendas. I think it's safe to say. A lot after World War II, you see a shift in it. Also during outside events happening in their countries and revolutions and just needs to leave and things like that.
Yeah. The biggest shift in sentiment towards Chinese food, I saw like one of the main factors was actually prohibition in the United States, because for many um, cuisines, there were this kind of, traditionally you would have it with like beer and steak, and American foodways are traditionally accompanied by an alcoholic beverage. That's you know how it's had been since colonial period. Um, but Chinese food was not associated with alcohol in that same way. And so while other types of restaurants were closing down during Prohibition, um, Chinese restaurants were seeing an increase in business because people still want to go out to eat, but they don't, they're not allowed to have their alcohol anymore. So you start to see that, and it actually, the Chinese restaurants start to take advantage of it and start to try and market themselves as modern and fancy and hip, and you start getting what are called chop suey palaces. They're like these massive, massive restaurants that can see hundreds, even low thousands per night. But they become places of white courtship where young men can bring their ladies, and it's an affordable date. I think it's on average $1.25 for two people, which with inflation comes out to like $30 for two people for a meal. Plus you
Nice.
get live music and dancing or a performance, things like that. So yeah, so you can see these kind of chop suey palaces. And it becomes a way for young men to kind of impress on his woman that he's worldly and cultured, and women have access to these experiences that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. And so it helps them kind of feel like they're participating in this in a wider world. And so the 1920s is kind of really when we see the biggest shift in kind of favorability towards Chinese restaurants, and then it just like pretty much keeps going from there. And it does then, as people become more and more familiar with Chinese food, as other Asian immigrants come into the country and start bringing their cuisines as well, they're less kind of the way has been paved by the introduction through Chinese food. And so you start to see things like Japanese restaurants and Thai restaurants and Vietnamese they have a slightly easier time getting into the broader American, palate.
Have some menus. Slowly but surely. This is a really fun one. I loved the colors on this. The NYPL menu collection is, always say this is one of the best resources. And it gives you an idea of what was being served and just the volume of food that was being served as well, and how many different kind of things that you can get. Got this one from the 1970s. I pulled this one from the early 1900s, 1907. So this was the menu for the dinner to the Governor Gould, who came to Chinatown, Boston. So you can see pigs in a blanket mixed in with shark wings and chop suey, mixed in with chow mein and olives and celery. So you have these kind of mixes in cuisine of what do we eat, what are we going to eat, how do we mix it together, and it just kind of comes together in these kind of menus. I have the Oriental restaurant from early 1904 as well, so you can see. I think this one had multiple pages, so I just picked the first page. A lot of these were like very cover to cover, covered in like different kinds of foods, which would all sound delicious. And a lot of the things that you still see today, right? You still have your chow mein, still have the same kind of noodles, fried lobster, mushrooms, chicken, boneless pineapple. Like the tastes are the same. I have one for the Harbor Inn in the 1970s. So you can see that comparison where it gets a little bit more fancy with the addition of, special American dinners are at the bottom. Um, and kind of reaching into that palette as you're going into a traditional Chinese restaurant as well. Spoilers, spoilers. But you can see, right? These are all multiple pages. They can't fit them all in there, but just the amount of food that was on there is just like, how do you choose? I'm the millennial. If there's more than a couple more than options, I get very overwhelmed and I have to go back several times, or I just order a bunch of stuff and I take it home. But real Peking and Shanghai style also with Cantonese cooking. So you get this mixture of like when the immigrants first get here, they're like, no, this is where I'm from. This is the cuisine that I'm having. And then over time to make that restaurant successful, they start taking from other areas and they're like, no, it's fine. It'll all mix together. What do they know? And then you get this like beautiful concoction that is chop suey, I guess. Is that a good segue into it? Because it's like the fortune cookie, chop suey, like a few other ones just become these very Americanized meals that have no roots in any Asian cultures. And then become these like staples of menus in the menus. Right? Like
Yeah.
I mean, you probably have differing information of where chop suey came from because I found 4 different origin stories and I found a New York historian who was very set on saying that she was the right one as well.
Yeah, there's definitely several different origin stories surrounding chop suey and kind of how chop suey became like like the classic Chinese, American Chinese dish. And it also helps to turn Chinese food from something that's like dirty and dangerous and with the chefs using cooking rats and cats and stuff like that. With chop suey kind of turns it more sophisticated and safe and I think some of it comes from just marketing of these origin myths around chop suey because one of them that I saw kind of capitalized on by a lot of early Chinese restaurants is the story that when a high-ranking Chinese diplomat, Li Hongzhang, visited Washington, D.C. in the 1890s, there's a couple of, somehow he becomes involved with chop suey. Either his chef is trying to make a dish that will satisfy both his employer's Chinese palate plus the American's palate. But then there's also the story where Li Hongzhang goes to a Chinese restaurant in DC after he couldn't get food at the hotel he was staying at. And the chef at the Chinese restaurant didn't have anything there. So he just like threw a bunch of leftovers into a dish to serve to this diplomat. But because Li Hongzhang was the highest ranking Chinese diplomat to visit the United States at that point, he brings this sophistication to the dish of chop suey. And a lot of Chinese restaurateurs capitalize on that and start saying, this is the dish that our diplomats, our high-ranking court officials are eating, even if there's little or no kind of analogous dish in China itself. Although there's even questions about that, because it's basically just like a standard
over. It did.
Yeah, I think there was an article I saw that the New York Public Library did. They went through all of their Chinese restaurant menus, and the variations of chop suey is like every single menu has chop suey. And it becomes so popular that like other unrelated dishes that are like nothing to do with Chinese food end up with this chop suey name. We're like, there's the macaroni ground beef tomato sauce casserole, is sometimes called American chop suey. It's also called American
Ooh.
goulash. But I most often see it called American chop suey, um, which has, I don't know how it got that name, but um,
I did read it was by 1903. This is how popular it became. It was estimated that there was over 100 chop suey houses between 14th and 45th Street. So going from downtown all the way up to Midtown. Um, and it doubles by 1920. So this was just like they were chop suey houses, like we were showing, like the Tuxedo restaurant, Tuxedo Chinese restaurant. And it was just, it was like Catherine said, it's not clear where it came from. The historian that I was looking at said that they kind of capitalized on his visit, but all of his food was heavily documented allegedly, and he didn't eat anything except for like boiled vegetables. But it was just, it's one of those things that people just ran with, and it made sense. And it worked. Chop suey is still on menus today. I think it's probably exactly the same as it was in the 1900s. But you can really see it was this time of the late 18th, early 19th century. You have all of these like emerging middle class kids, like you said, going to these enclaves and eating all of this food because it was like this is how we're going to become worldly and travel the world and expand our taste buds and learn about people and different cultures. Um, and it's when, you start getting actual food critics into Chinese restaurants to start reviewing them as opposed to just going, we don't do that. And you can start to see it become this very professionalized, like, no, they're going to start getting critics in. It's going to be real. Like you see them expanding out of just Chinatown. And it's very interesting. You can see, just how exciting, I guess. I'm trying to look at my notes and I do apologize on my computer. I am not looking away from the screen. But I have there was one recipe that I found. Oh my goodness, there's so many buttons. Share. I found a chop suey. Oh, come on. Chop suey recipe in one of our cookbooks from the Flatlands Dutch Reformed Church from 1968. So it's American chop suey. I don't know what the difference is. It seems add potatoes. I think that might be the big difference. Like farmland Dutch, I don't know, but I don't understand. But I did find the American chop suey recipe, and I was like, this feels pretty accurate to a restaurant esque situation. Um, but it's given to us from Hilda Mazzetta of Flatlands. Um, has anybody ever made chop suey at home? Or is it something that they like to order from the restaurants? Like, what is your favorite thing to order? Because now I'm interested because I was like, I mean, listen, I love the standard, typical, very Americanized meals. I'm not even gonna lie about it. It's what I grew up with. It's a safe flavor for me because I grew up eating it. I will always try something new. I will always try something a little bit more spicy. You don't say no, especially when you have a very picky 6 year old and she's watching you. You have to try new things. You have to explore your taste buds. I live in New York City. You got to try new things. But I thought it was very interesting that this made it into a 1968 Dutch Reformed Church cookbook. So it must have been very popular.
This looks like halfway between the American Chinese chop suey from a restaurant and what ends up being the American chop suey with the macaroni that I was talking about.
Oh,
So
ooh.
maybe that's where the name comes from. If it was first with rice and then that was swapped out for macaroni, because all the other things like the ground beef and onions and tomatoes is very much like
Yeah.
yeah. That's really interesting.
the cookbook itself has a lot of like weird Jello recipes. It has this. It's got like meatballs. It's got like a strange Greek dish that I've never heard of that has very Americanized also as well. So it's just like something was going on in Brooklyn in the 60s. They were trying new things. They didn't know how they felt about it, but they were trying it. Um, but it was, you got to try new things, guys.
So I think chop suey can also help us kind of shift away from the American Chinese food, which we've talked a lot about, into American Japanese food, because the early Japanese restaurants also, most of them served things like chop suey, chow mein, egg foo young, because that's what the people wanted. So even though you have Japanese restaurants opening up in the United States in the early 1900s, they all kind of have to also serve Chinese food. And so you do get a lot of Japanese immigration coming into the United States in the late 19th century with because the Chinese Exclusion Act opens up a lot of these labor jobs. And so the Japanese kind of fill in where the Chinese have now been excluded. And so they start bringing their cuisine. But again, like with the first Chinese immigrants, that food is generally for the community. And you don't get, but America has gone through like phases of fascination with Japan, as well as China. And I did find the first like recorded Japanese restaurant that white people went to was opened in New York City by Louis Sherry. So not a Japanese man, but he was capitalizing on the popularity of Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado operetta, which is also has nothing to do with Japan, really, except being some sort of like a pastiche of what they thought Japan was like. But it was very much, he was building on this popularity of the Mikado to create a quote unquote Japanese restaurant. But that does open up space for actual Japanese immigrants to open up Japanese restaurants as well.
And the first restaurant to serve raw fish sushi in New York City opens in 1963, and they're still functioning. And one of the oldest sushi restaurants in general is from 1984 in New York City, and they're still going. And if you look at them, they're very fancy. They don't look like you're going to be wearing jeans into these establishments. They are very fancy. They're very upscale. Nippon was the first restaurant to successfully petition to the FDA to allow the infamously toxic but tasty torafugu ship to be imported to the United States, a popular seasonal delicacy added to our menu every day is literally on their website. So yeah, very fancy, very cool. It takes a little bit of time, but they're very, yeah. Every time I looked up like old school Japanese restaurants in New York City, they were always very like upscale, very sleek, very modern looking. The food is always just very delicately placed on the platter. It's very methodical.
Yeah, so one of the books I was reading was talking about how after World War II in the 1960s, when there's this health food, healthy living, craze, that's really when Japanese food takes off in America because it's seen as healthy. Lots of tofu, fresh vegetables, things like that. And so that's when Japanese food really catches on. But it's still not quite to the sushi point yet. We haven't quite been able to stomach the raw fish in the 1960s.
Takes a bit.
Yeah. But things like sukiyaki, teriyaki, tempura, all are kind of the standard Japanese food that people know in the 60s. Um, and actually, the thing that you said, that it's all like very kind of, it seems very high class and expensive. And the same thing, the way I mentioned, like early Japanese restaurants had to serve Chinese food because that's what people wanted. A lot of time these days, you see a lot of Chinese immigrants opening sushi restaurants because generally people are willing to pay more for Japanese food because it doesn't have the same legacy of being very cheap that Chinese food does. And it's a legacy that I think is being overturned in recent years, but is still lingering. And Japanese food did not have the same that same baggage to it.
It's definitely different barriers as you look at different time periods of who's been opening, how many restaurants there are. Um, and I think this willingness to try new food gets a little bit easier decade after decade after decade, where it's not so like faux pas to want to go into different neighborhoods where now it's expected almost of like, don't you want to go try new things? You can't just go eat at the diner every day. You have to go eat something different. You want to go try something new. And you always have that one adventurous friend that's like, I found the best restaurant ever. And it's like 1,000-year-old cuisine that they've been doing for millennia. Um, but this is Hasaki today. This is another still operating restaurant from the 80s that opened. So you can see they have photos from the 80s of when they first opened, and putting together the bar and everything. And then Hasaki today, which is again very clean, very minimal, very like fancy. Got to wear your suit and tie to these kinds of places. Very upscale New York City kind of situation. And then the takeout container, which was made for oysters and now is like synonymous with Chinese food takeout. So I think so. This patent was done in 1894 to carry oysters back, shelled oysters, yes. Um, and then sometime in the 1970s, one company started printing Chinese, like it's not really Chinese symbols, it's like faux stereotype Chinese symbols onto these containers. And they are the number one producer of all of these containers. And the logic behind this container was like, yeah, it holds things, but it also opens up into a plate with one fold, and it's ingenious. And now it's a container that is so synonymous with takeout food, specifically Chinese food. So it's one of those things that just started with something else and kind of grows into another thing, and it becomes this weird American symbol that's not quite Chinese, but it's not quite American, but it was done for different things. And watching this kind of play out is very interesting.
So one of the things I did want to mention in regards to the Japanese food, because a lot of I think because it is very recent into the American kind of food world, is that it is, I think, for the most part, seen as a lot more authentic. But American Japanese food has had a lot of influences. It has changed quite a bit, specifically because of the internment camps during World War II. It's affected a lot of the types of foods that, you know, second, third generation American Japanese are eating. And one of the things that kind of has entered into American Japanese cuisine that I thought was very interesting, because of the internment camps. So the internment camps during World War II really disrupted the traditional food cuisine of Japanese immigrants, because they could no longer they no longer had access to a lot of the things they need, a lot of the ingredients that were being imported from Japan, and they were reliant on what was available in the camps or what they could grow. And so this is one dish that was kind of made it started in the internment camps from things you could get at the commissary. And it's called a weenie royale. It's a casserole made of chopped onions, soy sauce, eggs, rice, and either hot dogs or Vienna sausage, because those were things that were available to them. And so I thought there's like some of these dishes really just stuck, whereas when the Japanese were released from these camps and back in, integrating into American society, understandably, they try and go back to their traditional foods. But there's just certain things that, that just change so drastically that they've kind of stuck into the cuisine. All right, so we've got a few minutes left. So if anyone has any questions or anything they want to ask or anything they want to share, just put it in the chat. The one thing I did want to say is this period is the Lunar New Year period, the Chinese New Year period. And so I did look a little bit at Chinese New Year celebrations in the United States. So the Chinese New Year, or the Lunar New Year, is the beginning of the Chinese calendar. It's the new moon that's halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. It is also celebrated in other Asian countries. Oftentimes they are countries that were colonized by the Chinese throughout their long history, bringing the lunar solar calendar to these places. So places like Vietnam, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore all have Lunar New Year celebrations as well. But the traditions surrounding the New Year are include things like returning home if you're working away. It's actually the largest annual human migration in the world. Is the 40-day period that begins before the new year and runs afterwards. This year it was estimated that there are 9 billion domestic trips in China happening in this period.
Oh.
And it's everybody going home to their hometowns to visit family, to visit friends for the new year. But just
that's so sweet.
That amount of people traveling in such a short period of time is insane. It's like impossible to comprehend, I think. So there's a lot of this returning home, visiting family and friends, plenty of feasting and fireworks, parades, things like that. And in the United States, there are some very famous Chinese New Year parades, including San Francisco, New York, and the first ever Chinese New Year's parade in the United States that I could find a record of was in San Francisco in 1850 or 1851. It was reported in the local newspaper with some disdain, but also fascination. And then every year after that, it just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is what is believed to be a Chinese New Year parade in San Francisco in 1880.
Cool. A lot of people, look at them on the roof.
Yeah, they're just everywhere.
That's great.
Yeah.
Celebration.
And then the first New York City Chinese New Year parade was in 1888. It featured a lion dance, firecrackers, and a procession down Mott Street. And it was organized by the local Chinese Commerce Society, or Chinese Cultural Society. And it was as a way to both unite the community, but also assert visibility in New York. And ever since 1888, the New York City Parade has grown and grown and is now a multi-day festival. And
I recommend everybody go.
Yeah.
It is very cool. It is very awesome.
So the New Year festival in China is actually it's a 2-week festival. And there's specific rituals and activities that happen on certain days. But we are actually coming up on the end of the 2 weeks. Tomorrow is what is known as Lantern Festival, which is the 15th day of the new year. It's the full moon. And paper lanterns are lit and to celebrate, and you have lion and dragon dances to help. They're supposed to shun negative spirits and make sure that you have good luck and fortune in the new year. And traditionally, so here's some lantern festival. You see those red paper lanterns that are so synonymous with China. And we have an old 15th century painting with the lanterns and firecrackers and parades happening. But since we are talking about food, traditionally on Lantern Festival, you would eat yuanshao or tangyuan, depending on which part of China you're from. You call them different things, but it is basically, it's a glutinous rice ball that's filled with a sweet filling like red beans or sesame paste. And apparently the roundness of the balls and the bowls symbolize family togetherness. And when you eat it, it brings your family harmony and happiness and luck for the new year. So
cool.
Yeah. So when I send out the recording, I do have a recipe for making tangyuan. I've never actually made it. My family always just buys them frozen. I do want to try one day. But I will share that recipe if anyone would like to try making some tangyuan.
Sounds wonderful. Are they very difficult to make?
It doesn't seem like it.
Oh, okay.
But and
it's like a spinach pie. It's just tedious.
Yeah, from reading the recipe, it seems fairly. I think it's just that the rice flour dough is kind of unusual. It doesn't have any gluten in it, so it's like really stiff. So we are coming up. We are at 8 o'clock. So I don't see any new questions.
Percentage of population that identifies as Asian American. I don't know nationally, but it was very low for New York City to have that kind of dash American attached to your ethnicity. Most people just identified as even a second generation as specifically Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, that kind of thing. I don't know what it would be nationally. It's a good question.
That's a good question. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you learned something. I hope you maybe are eager to order from your favorite Chinese restaurant or Japanese.
Try something new.
All right. And as always, I will be sharing the recording of tonight's program with everyone who's registered. It will be on our YouTube page. And I hope you will join us next month on March 11th. Same time, same place. And we will be talking about food in politics and propaganda. So that'll be a lot of, we'll see, it was World War I, World War II, Victory Garden
Victory
thing.
Garden.
There's
Fun thing.
plenty of tea parties. Talk about that too.
Ooh.
So plenty of stuff. So I hope you'll join us for that next month. Again, that's March 11th. And I hope everyone has a very lovely evening, and hopefully the winter thaws out soon if you're here in
Staten Island Chuck said spring was coming early, and he's more accurate than Punxsutawney Phil in Pennsylvania. I'm just saying.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Be safe, be well. We're all getting snow. Yeah. Be safe, be well, be warm.